There are moments in history when an organization becomes so wealthy, so well connected, and so quietly powerful that the rulers who once protected it begin to wonder whether they have created something they can no longer control. In medieval Europe, there was one organization that seemed to reach almost everywhere. They owned land in a dozen kingdoms. They moved money across continents at a time when most people never traveled further than the next market town. They built castles on the roads between empires. They answered directly to the Pope and to almost nobody else. Kings borrowed from them. Pilgrims trusted them with everything they had. Their knights fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the Crusades. And behind the walls of their commanderies, enormous quantities of silver, land deeds and promises moved quietly through their hands. They were called the Knights Templar, and their extraordinary rise would eventually produce an equally extraordinary question. What happens when an organization becomes more powerful than the rulers who once protected it? The answer arrived on a Friday, the 13th of October, in the year 1307. Before dawn, across the whole of France, sealed orders that had been sitting unopened in the hands of royal officials were finally broken. And almost simultaneously, in Paris, in Normandy, in Champagne, in Provence, in towns whose names have long since softened into the countryside, the doors of Templar houses were forced open. Men were pulled from their beds in the dark, commanders were seized, horses were led out of stables that had been theirs an hour earlier, chests were counted, deeds were carried away. Property that had taken nearly 200 years to accumulate was placed under royal seal before the sun had properly risen. And the accusations began to spread almost immediately. Heresy, secret rituals, idolatry, corruption, denial of Christ himself, one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe, began to disappear almost overnight. So here is the question that sits at the center of everything we are going to explore tonight. Were the Knights Templar destroyed because they were guilty of terrible crimes, or because they had simply become too powerful to be allowed to continue? Take a moment with that. It is a question that historians have been circling for 700 years, and it has never entirely resolved itself. Welcome to Sleep into Power. I am NJ. Tonight we are traveling back through medieval Europe and the Holy Land to uncover the rise and the fall of the most famous, the most misunderstood, and the most persistently mythologized organization of the Middle Ages. We will begin on the dangerous pilgrim roads of the early 12th century, where a handful of knights with almost nothing decided that somebody ought to protect the travelers being robbed and killed between the coast and Jerusalem. We will visit their strange headquarters on the Temple Mount, in a building that had been a mosque, that Christians believed had been the Palace of Solomon, and that gave the order the name the world still remembers. We will explore the peculiar idea of the warrior monk and the churchman who made that contradiction respectable. We will look at the enormous administrative machine that stood behind the famous white mantles, because the knights were only ever the smallest part of the story. We will follow the money and try to describe honestly what these men actually did with it, because the popular version of Templar finance is far less interesting than the truth. We will watch kings borrow from them. We will watch popes protect them. We will walk through their castles at sunset. We will follow the slow catastrophe of the later Crusades, the loss of Jerusalem, the fall of Acre, and the strange predicament of an organization that suddenly finds the reason for its existence has vanished. Then we will arrive at Philip IV of France, and the arrests and the accusations and the torture and the confessions and the retractions. We will look carefully at the mysterious head called Baphomet and where that image really came from. We will consider the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, and the curse he is supposed to have delivered from the flames. And then we will turn to the mysteries, the missing treasure, the vanished fleet, Portugal, Scotland, the Holy Grail, the Freemasons, and finally the deeper question underneath all of it. which is why human beings find secret orders so utterly irresistible, and why this particular order refuses to be forgotten. If you enjoy falling asleep while discovering history, psychology, power, and the strange stories that shaped civilization, do consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this quiet corner of the internet keep going. There is also a Sleep into Power book, if you would like to take the idea further than listening. It is about the hours before sleep, and how the state you enter the night in tends to shape the state you wake up in, built around a simple 5-part framework for using that time deliberately rather than letting it use you. You can find it on Amazon, in paperback and on Kindle. If you prefer to listen without a screen, Sleep into Power is on Spotify as well, and there is a second channel, Meditate into Power, which is where the guided meditations live, along with mindfulness, ambient relaxation, and calming sleep content. It is the quieter companion to this one, for the nights when you would rather not follow a story at all. For anyone who has ever wanted to support the channel directly, there is a Buy Me a Coffee page in the description. It is never expected, and it is always appreciated. A thank you tonight to the listener who suggested the Templars. You know who you are, and wherever you are listening from, whether it is late evening, or the small hours, or the middle of an afternoon on the other side of the world where sleep has decided to arrive out of sequence, you are very welcome here. So get comfortable. Let the room around you become quiet. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. And tonight, let us return to Jerusalem, in the early years of the 12th century. Begin with the road, not the city, not the temple, not the treasure, the road. Imagine a dirt track winding up out of the coastal plain, somewhere between the port of Jaffa and the hills that lead inland. It is early summer, the heat has already settled into the stones by mid-morning, and it will not leave them until long after dark. On either side of the track, the land is dry and pale and studded with rock, and the scrub grows in low grey clumps that offer shelter to almost nothing except snakes and the occasional goat. Along this track there is a line of people walking. They do not look like soldiers. They look like what they are, which is a group of exhausted civilians from Northern Europe who have been traveling for somewhere between 6 months and 2 years. Their clothes are the wrong weight for this climate. Their shoes have been repaired more times than they can count. Some of them are old, some of them are ill. A few of them are carrying children. They have come from Flanders, from Champagne, from Bavaria, from the villages of England and the valleys of the Auvergne. They have crossed the Alps or sailed the Adriatic. They have been cheated at borders, robbed at river crossings, overcharged for bread, quarantined, delayed, and buried along the way in numbers nobody bothered to record. And they have done all of this voluntarily, because they believe that walking to Jerusalem and praying at the places where Christ walked will alter something fundamental about the condition of their souls. This is pilgrimage, and to understand the Templars you have to understand that for a medieval European, this was not tourism, it was the single greatest undertaking of an ordinary life. People sold land to make the journey. They settled debts and disputes before leaving, because there was a real possibility they would not come back. They made wills, and in the year 1119, they were arriving in larger numbers than ever before, because 20 years earlier, something extraordinary and violent had happened. In 1099, the armies of the First Crusade had taken Jerusalem. The capture was accompanied by a massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants that horrified even some contemporary Christian chroniclers. And it is worth sitting with that rather than sliding past it, because the world the Templars were born into was built on it. What followed was the creation of a string of Christian states along the eastern Mediterranean coast, ruled by European nobles, permanently short of manpower, and surrounded by neighbors who had every reason to want them gone. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was one of those states. It held the city, and it held the ports, and in between it held a great deal of territory that was rather more theoretical than actual. The roads in particular belonged to nobody, or rather, they belonged to whoever happened to be standing on them at the time. Which brings us back to our line of pilgrims on the track from Jaffa. There is a place on that road, a defile between rocky slopes, where the path narrows and the ground rises on both sides. Bandits favored places like this, for the obvious reason that people walking through them cannot easily run. Contemporary accounts describe pilgrims being killed on these roads in significant numbers. One chronicler records hundreds dying near the Jordan in a single incident. Whether the figure is exact hardly matters. What matters is that everyone knew it happened, and everyone knew there was no realistic protection. The Kingdom of Jerusalem did not have enough soldiers to garrison its own walls, let alone patrol the empty country between them. A knight was an expensive thing. He required a war horse, or ideally several, and armor, and a squire, and land to support all of it. The kingdom had perhaps a few hundred at any given moment, and every one of them was needed on the frontier. So the roads stayed dangerous, and the pilgrims kept coming, and the arithmetic was as grim as it was simple. Into this situation, around 1119, walked a French knight from Champagne, named Hugues de Payens. We know less about him than we would like. He was a nobleman of modest standing, connected to the Counts of Champagne, probably in his 40s by this point, and he had been in the Holy Land for some years. With him was a knight from Picardy, called Godfrey de Saint-Omer, and a small number of others, whose names appear in later sources with varying reliability. Their proposal was straightforward. They would take religious vows, and they would live as a religious community, and their particular service to God would be the protection of pilgrims on the roads. It is worth pausing to notice how unremarkable this must have sounded at the time. The traditional account says there were 9 of them, and that they remained 9 for 9 years. It is a satisfying number, which is usually a warning sign. The 12th century Syrian chronicler Michael the Syrian gives a figure closer to 30. William of Tyre, who is our most detailed early source, was writing several decades after the events he describes, and had his own reasons for shaping the story a particular way. Modern historians, including Malcolm Barber, whose work on the order remains the standard scholarly account, treat the 9 knights as a tradition rather than a documented fact. But whatever the precise number, they were few. They had no wealth, they had no castles. They had no fleet, no banking network, no political influence and no treasure. They had horses, weapons, and an idea. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, who had recently come to the throne and who understood perfectly well that unpaid volunteers policing his roads cost him nothing, gave them somewhere to live. And where he gave them would change everything. The royal palace in Jerusalem at that time occupied the southern end of the great platform that dominates the city. Muslims know it as the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. Christians called it the Temple Mount. It is an enormous artificial plateau, built up over centuries, at the heart of which stood the Jewish temple until the Romans destroyed it in the year 70. On this platform stand 2 buildings that the Crusaders had taken over and renamed according to their own understanding of what they were looking at. The magnificent golden domed structure they called the Temple of the Lord. It is in fact the Dome of the Rock, completed in 691 under the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik, one of the oldest surviving Islamic monuments in the world, and among the most beautiful buildings ever raised by anyone. The other, at the southern end, was the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Crusaders, noting that it stood on the site of the ancient temple complex, decided it must be the surviving palace of Solomon, and called it the Temple of Solomon. This was where Baldwin had established his royal residence, and in 1119, or thereabouts, he moved out and handed a portion of it over to Hugues de Payens and his companions. Sit with the image for a moment. A handful of penniless French knights, sleeping in the converted wing of a mosque, on the platform where Solomon's temple was believed to have stood, in a city that had changed hands in blood 20 years earlier, in a kingdom that could not defend its own roads. They took their name from the building, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. It is a long name, and it was quickly shortened, first in speech and then in every document that mattered, to something simpler, the Templars. That address, chosen for reasons of pure administrative convenience by a king who wanted his road problem solved cheaply, would generate more speculation than almost any other detail in the entire story. Because once you have told the world that a secretive order of warrior monks lived directly above the foundations of Solomon's temple, you have planted something in the human imagination that will grow for centuries whether you water it or not. We should be careful here, and I want to be careful with you, because this is the point at which most tellings of the Templar story quietly slip their moorings. There is no historical evidence that the early Templars excavated beneath the Temple Mount. There is no evidence that they found the Ark of the Covenant, or the treasure of Solomon, or a set of documents that would have destroyed the church. These claims appear in the 20th century, not the 12th. They are constructed backwards, from the assumption that an organization which became rich must have found something, rather than forwards from any source. What is true is that the Crusaders used the vaulted spaces beneath the platform, the enormous underground chambers that later became known as Solomon's Stables, as stabling for horses. That is not a secret, it is architecture. The Templars kept animals in a large medieval undercroft, which is exactly what you would expect a military order in a crowded city to do with a large medieval undercroft. But you can feel how easily the one becomes the other. Knights, vaults, Solomon, darkness, digging. Hold that thought, because the gap between what people know and what people imagine is going to become one of the central themes of tonight's story. It is the gap that made the Templars famous, and in the end, it is the gap that killed them. For now, though, they were 9 men, or perhaps 30, living in borrowed rooms, riding out on dusty roads to escort frightened travelers past the places where other travelers had died. Nobody watching them would have predicted anything at all. Let the picture settle. Jerusalem, in the early morning. Limestone walls turning gold as the sun comes over the eastern hills. Narrow streets already filling with the noise of the markets, the smell of bread and dust and animals. The mixture of languages you would have heard in no other city on earth. Greek and Latin, Arabic and Armenian, Syriac and the rough French of the northern nights. Above all of it, the great platform and the golden dome, and a converted mosque where a few obscure men were about to become the most famous brotherhood in European history. There is a contradiction at the center of the Templar identity, and it is worth naming clearly, because the medieval world felt it too. A monk withdraws from the world. He gives up property, family, and self-determination. He submits to a rule, rises in the dark to pray, eats what he is given, sleeps when he is told, and spends his life attempting to become smaller so that something larger might occupy the space. A knight does the opposite. A knight is trained from childhood in violence. He is defined by lineage, by land, by horses, by reputation, by the capacity to kill other men efficiently while wearing a great deal of expensive metal. The entire culture of knighthood in the 12th century was concerned with honor, display, and the pursuit of glory. The Templars were asked to be both at once. They took the 3 vows that every religious community took: poverty, which meant owning nothing personally; chastity, which meant no marriage and no relationships; obedience, which meant surrendering the right to decide what to do with their own days. And then, they were sent out to fight. The medieval church had spent centuries being distinctly uncomfortable about killing. There were penances imposed on soldiers who killed in battle, even in wars the church itself had endorsed. There was a long tradition of thought about when violence might be permissible and when it decidedly was not. To place a sword in the hand of a man who had just taken monastic vows was not a small step. It required a theological argument, and it required someone with the intellectual authority to make it. That someone was Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard is one of those figures who is difficult to overstate. A Cistercian abbot, born into Burgundian nobility around 1090, he became the most influential churchman in Europe without ever holding high office. He advised popes. He denounced kings. He preached the Second Crusade to enormous crowds. He wrote with a fluency and force that survives translation 8 centuries later. When Bernard endorsed something, Europe listened, and Bernard endorsed the Templars. Around 1129, Hugues de Payens traveled back to Europe to seek official recognition and support. At the Council of Troyes, in Champagne, in January of that year, the order received formal approval and a rule of life. Bernard's involvement in that rule, and his subsequent treatise in praise of the new knighthood, gave the Templars something more valuable than money. They gave them legitimacy. The argument Bernard constructed was startling in its confidence. He distinguished between the ordinary knight, whom he regarded as essentially a well-dressed thug motivated by vanity, and the new knight, who fought without personal ambition, without desire for glory, without pleasure in the act, purely as an instrument of a purpose beyond himself. The ordinary knight killed for himself. The new knight, Bernard argued, did not kill men so much as evil, and if he died gaining rather than losing. It is a powerful piece of writing, and it is also, viewed from here, a piece of writing that did an enormous amount of damage. This is one of those places where honesty matters more than atmosphere. The theology that made the Templars possible was the same theology that made holy war respectable. And holy war in the 12th century meant what it has always meant, which is villages burned and populations displaced and civilians killed by people entirely convinced of their own righteousness. The Templars were not innocent of this. No armed order in the crusading states was. But Bernard's endorsement transformed them. Before Troyes, they were a small group of volunteers with an unusual arrangement. After Troyes, they were an approved religious order with a written rule, a recognized habit, and the moral authority of the most respected voice in Christendom. Donations began arriving almost immediately. Land in Champagne, land in Provence, land in England, where Hugues de Payens traveled and was received by King Henry I. Money, arms, horses, and men. The rule itself is a fascinating document, and it grew over time from around 70 clauses to several hundred as the order encountered situations nobody had anticipated. It regulated everything: what brothers ate and how often meat was permitted, how many horses each rank could keep, that they should eat in silence, in pairs, sharing a dish, watching one another to ensure neither ate too much nor too little, that they should sleep clothed in a lit dormitory, that their hair should be cut short but their beards left uncut, which is why the Templars in contemporary illustration look distinctly unlike the clean-shaven knights around them. There were rules about pointed shoes, which were forbidden as a vanity. Rules about hunting, which was forbidden as a pleasure, with the single exception of lions, which the rule treats as a spiritual matter as much as a practical one. Rules about speaking after the last office of the day. Rules about the correct response when a brother was accused of a fault, and the correct penance when he was found guilty, and the process by which he might be expelled. And rules about battle. A Templar could not retreat unless the order was given, or unless the banner had fallen. He could not leave the field while the black and white standard still flew. This discipline, in an age when knightly cavalry tended to charge magnificently and then disperse in pursuit of loot, made the Templars genuinely formidable. Muslim chroniclers, who had no reason to flatter them, noted their steadiness. Saladin's biographer described them as the most dangerous of the Frankish forces. Now picture them: a column of riders on the coast road, moving at a walk in the heat. the knights in white mantles over mail, the red cross on the left shoulder, granted later in the order's history, and instantly recognizable. Behind and around them the sergeants in black or brown, less heavily armored, more numerous. Grooms leading spare horses, Turcopoles, locally recruited light cavalry, ranging ahead. The whole formation moving with a coherence that says, to anyone watching, that these men have done this many times before and expect to do it many times again. They are quiet. There is very little of the noise and boasting that accompanied a normal feudal host. The rule discouraged it. What you would hear is harness, hooves on stone, and the occasional order. That silence was part of the reputation. But here is where we need to widen the frame, because the men in white mantles were never more than a small fraction of the organization, and the popular image of the Templars as an army of knights has obscured something far more interesting about what they actually were. For every knight, there were perhaps 10 other people. There were sergeants who fought but came from non-noble families. There were chaplains, priests of the order who heard confessions and said Mass, a privilege that made the Templars unusually self-contained in religious terms. There were squires and grooms and armorers and saddlers. There were masons and carpenters who built the castles. There were cooks and infirmarians and men who managed the water supply. And in Europe, far from any battlefield, there were farmers. This is the part of the story that almost never makes it into films, and it is the part that explains everything else. The Templars were, in institutional terms, one of the largest agricultural landholders in Western Europe. Donations of land arrived steadily from the 1130s onwards, given by nobles for the good of their souls, or in exchange for prayers, or as part of the complicated spiritual economics of the medieval aristocracy. Some gave a field, some gave a village, some, at the end of their lives, gave everything they had and entered the order as a lay associate. These holdings were organized into commanderies, sometimes called preceptories. A commandery was not a castle. In most of Europe, it was a working estate with a chapel, a hall, barns, stables, workshops, and fields, run by a commander with a small handful of brothers and a much larger workforce of tenants and laborers. There were hundreds of them. In France, in England, in Scotland, in Ireland, in Portugal, in the Spanish kingdoms, in Italy, in the German lands, in Hungary, in Poland. Wherever there was land and a lord willing to part with some of it, there was eventually a Templar house. What did they produce? Everything a medieval estate produced. Grain, wine, wool, timber, livestock, salt, hides, honey. They held mills, and mills were the industrial machinery of the age. They held rights to markets and fairs. They held urban property in towns and cities. In London, their house on the Thames, the New Temple, sat on prime land that carries their name to this day. And every year, a portion of everything these estates generated was gathered, converted into transportable form, and sent east. This was the responsion, the share of income owed by each European house to the central organization in the Holy Land. In principle, it was a third. In practice, it varied. But the system meant that a Templar knight standing on a wall in Palestine was being fed and armed and horsed by the profits of a wheat field in Hertfordshire, and a vineyard in Aquitaine, and an olive grove in Provence. Think for a moment about what that requires. It requires accurate records of what each estate owes. It requires people who can read, write, and calculate. It requires a chain of houses along the routes to receive, store, and forward goods. It requires shipping, and therefore ports, and therefore agreements with port authorities. It requires the ability to convert wheat into silver, and silver into weapons, across borders, in different currencies, without losing so much to transaction costs that the whole exercise becomes pointless. It requires, in other words, an international logistics operation, and in the 12th century, almost nobody else had one. Kings did not, particularly. A medieval monarchy was a personal enterprise held together by loyalty and presence, which is why kings spent so much of their lives traveling. Merchants operated networks, but usually regional ones, and they had no legal privileges to protect them at borders. The church had reach, but its structures were diocesan and local rather than integrated. The Templars had something genuinely unusual. A single institution, under a single command, with physical premises in most of the kingdoms of Christendom, staffed by literate administrators bound by vows of obedience, exempt from many local jurisdictions, and possessing the armed capacity to protect its own property. Nobody set out to build this. It was assembled almost accidentally, one donated field at a time, in service of a mission 1,000 miles away. But once you have built it, you have built something that can do more than move wheat. You have built something that can move money. And here the story shifts. Because from this point onward, the Templars stop being simply a military order and start becoming something for which the medieval world did not really have a word. What happens when a brotherhood created to guard a road becomes an institution that spans a continent? We are about to find out. But before we go there, let the picture rest for a moment on something quieter. A commandery in the English countryside in the 1160s. Autumn. Low grey light. The fields have been cut and the stubble is pale. And somewhere out of sight, a man is calling to oxen. The buildings are stone and modest. A chapel, often round in England, echoing the shape of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, so that a farmer in Lincolnshire could stand inside a small architectural memory of a city he would never see. There are perhaps 4 brothers here. One of them, decades ago, fought at Ascalon. The others have never been further east than Dover. They rise before dawn to pray, and they will pray again 7 times before the day is finished. And in between, they will inspect the barns and settle a dispute about a boundary hedge and check the accounts against last year's. Nothing about this scene looks like power. But multiply it by several hundred, connect it with roads and ships and letters and a shared discipline, and give it 2 centuries, and it becomes one of the most remarkable institutions of the medieval world. Let us talk about the money, because this is the part of the Templar story that fascinates modern audiences most, and it is also the part that is most consistently misrepresented. You will often hear that the Templars invented banking. They did not. Banking, in various forms, is considerably older than the 12th century, and the sophisticated commercial instruments of the later Middle Ages were developed principally by Italian merchant families in Florence, Siena, Genoa, and Venice, and drew on practices already established in the Islamic world and in Byzantium. So set that claim aside. What the Templars actually did is more specific, and in some ways more interesting. Start with a practical problem. You are a pilgrim in 1180. You live in Burgundy. You intend to travel to Jerusalem, which will take you the better part of a year each way, and you will need money for the entire journey. Ships, food, lodging, bribes, tolls, guides, and the possibility of ransom. So you need to carry a substantial quantity of silver coin across half the known world, through territories governed by people who do not know you and owe you nothing, on roads where robbery is not an unusual event, but an expected one. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is very close to an insoluble problem, and it had suppressed long-distance travel for centuries. Now consider what the Templars could offer. They had a house near you. They had houses along the route. They had a house in the Holy Land. All of these houses belonged to the same organization, kept records in the same manner, and were staffed by men bound to the same rule under the same command. So you could deposit your money or entrust your property with the brothers at home and receive documentation. You then traveled with very little of value on your person. And on arrival, you presented your documentation and drew on what was owed to you. The precise mechanics are debated, and the surviving evidence is frustratingly thin, which is itself worth saying plainly. We do not possess a Templar banking manual. We do not have a run of accounts explaining the system from the inside. Malcolm Barber, again, is careful to note how much of what is confidently asserted about Templar finance rests on inference rather than documentation. What we have are scattered references in other people's records, royal accounts, legal disputes, and chronicles. But those references are consistent enough to tell us something. We know the Templars held deposits for individuals and institutions and crowns. We know they made loans and charged for them in ways carefully structured to avoid the Church's prohibition on usury, typically by building the cost into the terms rather than naming it as interest. We know they acted as trustees, holding contested property or disputed sums until a resolution was reached, because both parties trusted them more than they trusted each other. We know they administered estates on behalf of absent owners, particularly crusaders who had gone east and needed someone to run their affairs in the meantime. We know they transported bullion under armed escort by land and sea. We know they collected taxes. When a levy was raised for a crusade, it was frequently Templar houses that received it, held it, and forwarded it. And we know they stored valuables, including the valuables of kings. The temple in Paris became, for a substantial period, effectively the treasury of the French crown. Not merely a place where the crown kept some money, but the institution where royal finances were physically administered by Templar officials in Templar buildings, with royal officers working alongside them. In London, the new temple performed a similar function for the English crown. King John left valuables there. Henry III kept the crown jewels in Templar custody. Pause on that arrangement for a moment, because it is genuinely strange. The two most powerful monarchies in Western Europe kept their money in buildings owned by an international religious order which was legally exempt from their authority and which answered to the Pope. Why would any king agree to that? Because it worked, and because the alternatives were worse. A royal treasury in the 12th century was vulnerable in ways that are hard to appreciate now. It could be seized in a succession dispute. It could be embezzled by the officials who ran it. It could be lost in a rebellion. The Templars offered something no royal official could. They were incorruptible in the specific structural sense that they could not personally benefit, having taken vows of poverty. They were permanent, in a way that individual officials were not. Their buildings were fortified and garrisoned. Their records were meticulous. And their reputation was their entire operating capital, which gave them a stronger incentive to honesty than any oath could. There is also something subtler at work. A king who deposits with the Templars is not just storing money. He is buying access to a network that reaches into every kingdom he might need to pay someone in. If a French king needs to send funds to an ally in the Levant, or ransom a nobleman held in Egypt, or subsidize a campaign in Spain, the Templars can do it. Almost nobody else can. Now hold two facts in your mind together. The first is that this organization was created to protect travelers on a road. The second is that, within 2 generations, it was managing the finances of the most powerful men in Europe. Nobody planned this. There was no strategy document. It emerged, as most institutional power emerges, from a series of individually sensible decisions that nobody stepped back to assess in aggregate. And here is the psychological point, which is really the heart of tonight's story. Military strength gives you one kind of power. It is loud, visible, and expensive. And it is also brittle, because armies can be defeated in an afternoon. Control over the movement of money gives you a different kind of power entirely. It is quiet. It does not announce itself. It accumulates slowly, through relationships and records and reliability, and it becomes load-bearing before anyone notices that it has. By the year 1200, if the Templars had simply stopped functioning, the financial arrangements of several kingdoms would have been thrown into disarray. That is not the power to command, it is the power to be depended upon, which is, in many circumstances, the more durable of the two. Kings borrowed from them, and this deserves examining rather than simply stating. Medieval kingship was chronically underfunded. A king's ordinary income came from his own lands, from customs, from feudal dues and from justice, and it was rarely sufficient for anything beyond ordinary government. War was not ordinary government. War was ruinous. A single campaigning season could cost several years of royal revenue. Castles cost fortunes. Edward I of England would later spend sums on his Welsh castles that a modern reader has to convert carefully before believing. Crusades cost more still, because they combined the expense of an army with the expense of transporting it 2,000 miles and supplying it there. So kings borrowed, constantly, from merchants, from Jewish moneylenders whose position in medieval society was appallingly precarious, and who were periodically expropriated and expelled when the debts became inconvenient, from Italian banking houses, and from the military orders. The Templars lent to Louis VII of France during the Second Crusade, and the sums were large enough that the arrangement caused friction. They lent to the English crown repeatedly. They advanced ransom money, including for the release of Louis IX after his disastrous Egyptian campaign, where a Templar treasurer's reluctance to open the coffers produced one of the more revealing anecdotes of the period, since it took a nobleman's threat to break the chests open before the money moved. Notice what that story tells us. The Templars were not simply obliging servants of royal power. They negotiated, they resisted, they had their own view of what their assets were for, and they could afford to hold that view because of the second pillar of their independence, which was papal protection. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a bull known from its opening words as Omne Datum Optimum. It is one of the most consequential documents in the order's history, and its provisions are worth setting out plainly, because everything that follows depends on them. The Templars were placed under the direct protection of the papacy. They answered to the Pope alone. Bishops could not excommunicate them, could not interfere in their houses, could not summon them to local church courts. They were permitted their own priests, who were subject only to the Grand Master. They were exempted from paying tithes, and permitted to receive them. They could build their own chapels and bury their own dead. Whatever they won in battle from their enemies was theirs to keep. Subsequent bulls extended these privileges further. They were granted rights to collect alms. They were protected from those who might attack their persons or property, with spiritual penalties attached. Consider the cumulative effect. An organization now existed which owned property in every kingdom of Latin Christendom, but was not fully subject to the laws of any of them, which had its own priesthood, which could not be taxed by local bishops or, in most circumstances, by local lords, which maintained fortified houses and armed men, which controlled substantial capital, and whose superiors sat not in Paris or London or Palermo, but in Rome and in the field in Palestine. This is what people mean when they say the Templars became more powerful than kings, and we should be careful with the phrase, because taken literally, it is nonsense. The Templars never ruled a European kingdom. They could not levy armies against Christian monarchs. They could not depose anyone. In any direct confrontation with a determined king in his own territory, they would lose, and eventually they did. But power is not only the ability to command, it is also the ability to be beyond someone else's reach. And there is a particular kind of discomfort that comes over a ruler when he realizes that an organization operating inside his borders, holding land he cannot tax and money he sometimes owes, is not actually answerable to him. That discomfort took a long time to become dangerous. For most of the 12th and 13th centuries, the arrangement suited everyone. Kings valued Templar services, popes valued Templar loyalty, nobles valued Templar prayers. But institutions have a way of outliving the conditions that made them welcome. There is one more contradiction to sit with before we move east again, and it is perhaps the strangest of them all. Every individual Templar was a poor man. This was not a formality. When a brother was admitted, he surrendered his property. He could not own anything, not personally, not even the clothes he wore, which belonged to the order and were issued to him. When he died, he left nothing, because he had nothing to leave. If a brother was found after death to have concealed personal property, the rule prescribed that he be denied burial in consecrated ground, and there are recorded instances of bodies being disinterred. So we have men who owned nothing, belonging to an institution that owned an extraordinary amount. Vast estates across a dozen kingdoms, vineyards in Champagne and Aquitaine, mills on 100 rivers, flocks and herds, townhouses and rents, fortresses in the east that cost more than most kingdoms could raise, bullion in vaults, debts owed by the crowned heads of Europe. How can a man own almost nothing while belonging to an institution that owns almost everything? It is worth turning that over slowly, because it describes something that has never gone away. There is personal wealth, which is what an individual holds, and which dies with him, or is divided among his children and dissipates within 3 generations, as it almost always does. And there is institutional wealth, which is held by an entity that does not die, does not age, does not lose interest, does not gamble, and does not have to divide itself between quarreling heirs. The Templar brother had no personal wealth whatsoever, and yet he had access to a level of resource, security, mobility, and status that almost no individual of his time could match. He could travel across Europe and sleep in his own organization's houses the entire way. He was fed, clothed, armed, housed, and defended. He had colleagues in every kingdom. If he was captured, though the order would not ransom him, since the rule forbade paying more than a belt and a knife for a brother's freedom, his organization continued regardless. He owned nothing and had everything, because he belonged to something that outlasted him. This is not merely a medieval curiosity. It is the underlying structure of most enduring power, then and now. The families and institutions that hold wealth across centuries do not generally hold it as personal property. They hold it in structures, trusts, foundations, endowments, corporations, orders. Vehicles designed to survive the death of any particular person, and to prevent any particular person from spending it all. The Templars stumbled into that principle 600 years before it was formalized, and it made them enormously durable, until, of course, it made them a target. Because there is one obvious vulnerability in institutional wealth, and it is this. When the wealth belongs to nobody in particular, there is nobody in particular whose grief and outrage will follow you if you take it. Hold that thought. It will matter a great deal, later, on a Friday in October. Let us leave the ledgers for a while, and go and stand somewhere high up. The Mediterranean coast, somewhere south of Haifa, in the early 13th century. Late afternoon. The light has gone from white to amber, and the sea has taken on that particular deep blue that only happens in the hour before evening. You are standing on a headland that runs out into the water. Around you rise the walls of Chateau Pèlerin, the castle of the pilgrim, built by the Templars from 1218 onwards, on a rocky promontory, where the sea protects 3 sides, and enormous walls close off the 4th. It was one of the great fortifications of the crusading world, and it was never taken. When the Templars finally left it, they left because there was no longer any reason to stay. Feel the stone under your hand. It has been in the sun all day, and it is still warm, and it will hold that warmth for hours after dark. Below you, the water works against the base of the rock with a rhythm that has not changed since long before anyone built anything here. Gulls turn slowly. Somewhere behind you, a horse shifts in a stable, and the sound comes up through the courtyard. Why here? Because castles in the crusading states were never decorative. Every one of them was an answer to a specific strategic question. And if you understand the question, you understand the building. A castle controls something, sometimes a road, particularly where it passes through a place travelers cannot avoid, a bridge or a defile, or a pass between hills. Sometimes water, in a country where the difference between a well and no well is the difference between an army existing and not existing. Sometimes a harbor, because in the Levant everything ultimately arrived by sea. Sometimes farmland, because a fortress without a food supply is a very expensive way to starve slowly. And always, a castle projects reach. A garrison that can ride out 30 miles and return the same day has effectively claimed 30 miles in every direction, whether or not anyone recognizes the claim. The Templars held many such places. Bagras, guarding the pass into Antioch through the Amanus Mountains. Saved in Galilee, rebuilt at colossal expense in the 1240s, a project that a surviving contemporary account describes in remarkable financial detail. Tortosa on the Syrian coast, Chastelblanc inland from it, Gaza in the south, and Chateau Pellerin, where we are standing now. It is worth mentioning, because it is so often confused, that the most famous Crusader castle of all, Crac des Chevaliers, was not Templar. It belonged to the Hospitallers, the other great military order, and the two were rivals as often as allies. Now come down off the wall and walk into the fortress itself. The gate passage is deliberately awkward. It turns, so that anyone forcing entry cannot charge straight through, and there are openings above, from which unpleasant things could be dropped on them. Beyond it, the courtyard opens out, and the noise changes. Stone amplifies everything. Hooves, voices, a hammer on metal somewhere, the creak of a windlass drawing water. The stables are enormous. Horses were the single most valuable asset a military order possessed, and a knight might have 3 or 4. They ate an extraordinary amount, and moving fodder was one of the standing logistical problems of every campaign. The chapel is small and plain. Templar chapels usually were. No great cycle of paintings, no elaborate carving. The order was Cistercian in temperament, and Cistercian architecture is about proportion and light, rather than decoration. The refectory has long tables. The brothers eat in silence, in pairs, sharing a dish. Meat 3 times a week, if the rule is being kept. Wine, watered. A reading during the meal, so that the mind has somewhere to go while the body is occupied. The dormitory is a long room with beds along the walls. A lamp burns all night. Nobody sleeps naked. Nobody sleeps alone in a closed room. Every arrangement in the building is designed to prevent privacy, because privacy is where the rule assumed problems began. And there is an office, somewhere, with a chest, and in the chest there are documents. Letters from the commander of Aquitaine about the wine harvest. A list of what the English houses have sent this year, and a note that it is less than last year, and a query as to why. An instruction from Paris, a receipt. That chest is as much a weapon as anything in the armory. It is what connects this warm stone headland to a wheat field in Lincolnshire. Now let the day end here. The last office of the day is called compline, and after it, the rule imposes silence. The brothers go up to the dormitory. The lamps in the courtyard are lit, and then most of them are put out. The sentries change on the walls, and their footsteps are the only regular sound. The sea goes on working at the rock. Above the headland, the stars come out over the Mediterranean, in the enormous quantity that only happens in a world with no artificial light at all. The Milky Way is not a faint smudge, but a visible river across the sky. Men on watch have nothing else to look at for hours at a time, and they know the constellations the way you know the road home. There is nothing to do now until the bell before dawn. Let that stillness stay with you as we move forward in time, because the story is about to turn, and it turns slowly, the way historical disasters usually do. Not with a single catastrophe, but with a long accumulation of small losses that only become obvious in retrospect. The Crusader states had been founded in a moment of Muslim political fragmentation. That was not going to last. Through the 12th century, the territories around them consolidated. Zengi, then his son Nur ad-Din, gradually unified Syria. And then, in the 1170s, a Kurdish commander in Egyptian service, named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom Europe would come to call Saladin, took control of Egypt, and then of Damascus, and then of Aleppo, until the Christian states found themselves surrounded not by squabbling neighbors, but by a single power under a single competent ruler. Saladin deserves better than the flat treatment he often receives. He was a shrewd politician who spent as much energy fighting fellow Muslim rulers as fighting Christians. He was capable of considerable magnanimity and also of considerable ruthlessness, depending on circumstance and audience. And he had a strategic patience that his opponents largely lacked. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, meanwhile, was tearing itself apart over a succession crisis, court factions, and a series of personal rivalries that read, in the chronicles, like a particularly bitter family argument conducted with armies. It came to a head in the summer of 1187. On the 4th of July, in the hills above Lake Tiberias, in Galilee, the field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem marched out across waterless ground in the height of summer to relieve a besieged castle, and was destroyed. The place is called the Horns of Hattin, after two low volcanic hills that stand above the plain. What happened there was, in military terms, straightforward. An army was drawn away from its water supply, harassed for a day, forced to camp without wells, surrounded, and defeated on the second morning after a night in which the smoke of burning scrub blew across the camp. By the end of it, the field army of the kingdom no longer existed. The Templars and Hospitallers who were captured were executed, on Saladin's orders, because he considered the military orders too dangerous to release. Other prisoners were ransomed or enslaved. The Grand Master of the Temple, Gerard de Riedfort, was among the few spared, and he had been among those who pushed most strongly for the march that led to the disaster. Within months, Jerusalem itself surrendered. Saladin's treatment of the city in 1187 stood in deliberate contrast to what the Crusaders had done in 1099. There was no massacre, terms were negotiated, ransoms were set, many were paid, many were not, and a substantial number of those who could not pay were enslaved, which was the ordinary practice of the age and should not be softened. But the city was not put to the sword, and contemporaries on both sides noticed. The city that gave the Templars their name, their headquarters and their purpose was gone, 88 years after it was taken, and 68 years after they were founded. They would never get it back. There would be further crusades, and moments of recovery, and a period in the 1220s when Jerusalem was returned to Christian control by treaty rather than by war, an arrangement that satisfied nobody and lasted barely 15 years. But the trajectory was set. What followed was a century of shrinking. The Christian presence contracted towards the coast, holding ports and the castles that protected them, sustained by money and manpower from Europe that arrived in ever less reliable quantities. New powers rose in Egypt, the Mamluks, whose military capability exceeded anything the Crusader states had faced before, and whose leaders Baybars and later Kalawun set about reducing the remaining strongholds one by one. Safed fell in 1266. The garrison, which included many Templars, was killed after surrendering. Antioch fell in 1268. Crac des Chevaliers fell in 1271, and through all of it, the military orders kept fighting, which is worth acknowledging honestly. Whatever one thinks of the enterprise as a whole, and there is a great deal to be said against it, the Templars did not run. They garrisoned positions that everyone knew were indefensible. They took losses that would have destroyed any ordinary lordship. And they kept sending men east from Europe, decade after decade, into a situation that was visibly failing. Then came Acre. By 1291, Acre was effectively the last major Christian city in the Holy Land. It was a wealthy port, crowded, cosmopolitan, and factionalized to the point of absurdity, with different quarters controlled by Venetians, Genoese, Pisans, the military orders, and the royal government, all of whom loathed one another. In April, the Mamluk Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil arrived with an army and a siege train that contemporaries described with something close to disbelief. The bombardment went on for weeks. The walls were mined. Sections collapsed. On the 18th of May, the city was stormed. The Grand Master of the Temple, Guillaume de Beaujeu, was mortally wounded during the fighting at the walls. There is an account, from a source close to the events, of him turning away as if to leave, and being challenged by those around him for abandoning the fight, and lifting his arm to show the wound beneath it before he collapsed. Ships were leaving the harbor, not enough of them, and not fairly loaded, and there are accounts of extortion at the quayside that make grim reading. The Templar compound, on the seaward corner of the city, held out for another 10 days after the rest of Acre fell. It was strong, and it was supplied from the sea. Negotiations were attempted and broke down in violence. Then, the Mamluks mined the walls, and the great tower came down, collapsing onto attackers and defenders together, and it was finished. The remaining coastal positions were abandoned within weeks. Tortosa, Chateau Pellerin, that headland we stood on, evacuated in August without a siege, because there was no longer anything to defend. 2 centuries of Christian presence in the Levant ended in a summer. Now sit with the strangeness of the situation this created. The Knights Templar still existed. They were still wealthy. They still held hundreds of estates across Europe, still administered royal treasuries, still commanded fortresses in Spain and Portugal, still possessed a fleet, still recruited, still received donations, still elected Grand Masters, and held chapters, and enforced their rule. But the reason they had been created no longer existed. There were no pilgrim roads to guard, because there was nowhere for the pilgrims to go. There was no Holy Land to defend. There was no Temple of Solomon, no Jerusalem headquarters, no frontier. They had become, in the most precise sense, an institution in search of a purpose. What happens to an organization when the thing it was built to do disappears? Occasionally, it dissolves gracefully. Far more often it persists, because institutions do not experience purpose the way individuals do. They experience budgets, and staff, and property, and momentum. The estates still need managing. The brothers still need feeding. The chapters still meet. The machine continues to turn because it is a machine, and machines do not notice that the work has stopped arriving. And to those on the outside, that persistence begins to look like something else entirely. Not service, not sacrifice. Just wealth, held by men who no longer appear to be doing anything to deserve it. That is a very dangerous position for any institution to occupy. And in the years after 1291, the Templars occupied it completely. Criticism of the military orders did not begin in 1291. It had been accumulating for decades, and after Acre it became loud. Some of it was practical. If 2 great military orders had spent 2 centuries and immense resources defending the Holy Land, and the Holy Land had nonetheless been lost, then perhaps something about the arrangement was not working. There were serious proposals, discussed at the highest levels of the Church, to merge the Templars and the Hospitallers into a single order under a single command, on the reasonable grounds that their rivalry had been actively harmful. The Templars resisted this, as institutions generally resist mergers, and their resistance was noticed. Some of the criticism was moral. Chroniclers complained of Templar pride. There was a phrase in circulation, "to drink like a Templar," which tells you something about the reputation the order had acquired among people who saw its members in taverns rather than on battlefields. Whether the reputation was deserved is almost beside the point. It existed, and some of the criticism was simple resentment. Here was an organization exempt from tithes, exempt from many local jurisdictions, holding enormous quantities of land in every kingdom, sending its income abroad, and now unable to point to any obvious return on the investment. Add to this the general atmosphere of the period. The late 13th and early 14th centuries in Europe were anxious. The climate was worsening. Harvests were becoming less reliable, and the Great Famine of 1315 was only a few years ahead. Heresy hunting had become an established instrument of both ecclesiastical and secular authority, with the machinery developed against the Cathars in southern France, now available for use elsewhere. Accusations of secret ritual crime, of sacrilege, of unnatural practice, were part of the standard vocabulary of political attack. Into this situation walks Philip IV of France. He is one of the more difficult figures of the Middle Ages to read, and contemporaries found him difficult too. He was known as Philip the Fair, meaning handsome rather than just, and there are descriptions of him as impressive, silent and strangely opaque. One contemporary remark, quoted often enough that it has become the standard characterization, described him as neither a man nor a beast but a statue. What is not in doubt is his ambition and his method. Philip was engaged in a long project of building royal authority in France, at the expense of everyone else who held any. He extended royal justice. He asserted royal rights over the church within his kingdom. He surrounded himself with trained lawyers, men like Guillaume de Nogares, who understood how to use legal process as a weapon and who were entirely unsentimental about doing so. He also had a persistent, structural, humiliating problem with money. Philip's wars, chiefly against England in Gascony and against the Flemish towns, cost far more than his revenues could cover. His response was a sequence of expedients that reads like an escalating series of increasingly desperate measures. He debased the coinage repeatedly, so severely that he acquired a second nickname among those affected, the false coiner. He taxed the French clergy, which brought him into direct and spectacular conflict with Pope Boniface VIII. That conflict escalated to the point where, in 1303, Nogaret led an armed party to the papal residence at Anagni and seized the pope. Boniface was released after a few days and died shortly afterwards. It is difficult to overstate what a shocking event this was, and what it demonstrated about Philip's willingness to act against institutions that everyone had assumed were untouchable. He expelled the Jews of France in 1306, seizing their property and cancelling debts owed to them. This was mass expropriation dressed as piety, and it was extremely profitable. He moved against the Lombard bankers operating in France, arresting them and confiscating assets. Notice the pattern. Identify a wealthy group that lacks political protection, construct a justification, seize. And Philip owed the Templars money, substantial sums. He had also, in 1306, during a riot in Paris caused by his currency manipulation, taken refuge inside the Paris Temple, which is a detail with a certain grim irony to it. Since he sheltered in the fortress of the organization, he would destroy within 18 months. But it would be too simple to say that Philip destroyed the Templars because he owed them money. Historians who have worked most closely on the trial, Barber above all, tend to resist the purely financial explanation. And for good reason. The confiscated Templar property in France did not, in the end, make Philip rich. Much of it went to the Hospitallers, though the Crown extracted a great deal in administrative costs and delays first. The financial return was real, but not transformative. Something more complicated was happening. Philip and the lawyers around him seemed to have genuinely operated in a world where royal authority and religious purity had become intertwined. The king presented himself as the most Christian king, responsible for the spiritual health of his realm. Attacks on heresy were therefore attacks on disorder, and disorder was anything that stood outside royal control. There was also opportunity. The Templars after Acre were unpopular, purposeless in the public eye, and vulnerable. Their papal protector, Clement V, was a Gascon elected in 1305 who had never gone to Rome, who was residing in France, and who was in no position to resist French pressure. The order had no local political base, no lay lord to protect it, no popular affection, and its wealth was concentrated in places that could be seized in a single morning. Take politics, money, religious authority, rumor, institutional rivalry, and opportunity. Put them in the same room, and you have the conditions for what happened next. The immediate trigger, as far as we can reconstruct it, came from an informer, a man named Esquin de Fleuron, of whom we know frustratingly little, seems to have circulated allegations about Templar initiation rituals. He may have been a former Templar expelled from the order, or a prisoner who found the accusations useful. He reportedly took his story first to the King of Aragon, who was not interested, and then to Philip, who was. Through 1307, royal agents gathered testimony quietly, and in September, sealed orders went out to royal officials across France, with instructions that they were not to be opened until a specified date. Now we come to the morning itself. Friday, the 13th of October, 1307. It is dark. October in northern France, before dawn, is properly dark and properly cold. In hundreds of towns and villages, the royal bailiffs and seneschals have their instructions in front of them, and men assembled. The orders are precise. Arrest every member of the order. Seize every property. Inventory everything. Take the brothers into custody and hold them for questioning by the Inquisition. And it happens almost simultaneously. That simultaneity is the genuinely remarkable feature of the operation, and it is worth understanding why. This is a world with no telegraph, no reliable clocks, no standardized time. Coordinating an action across an entire kingdom at the same hour, without warning leaking, was a serious administrative achievement. It required trust in a chain of officials, and it required that none of them talk. It worked almost perfectly. In Paris, they came to the Temple, the great fortified complex on the right bank, and arrested the Grand Master himself. Jacques de Molay had been in the city for weeks. The previous day, he had walked as a pallbearer at the funeral of the king's sister-in-law. There is no indication he had any idea what was coming. Around 620 men were taken in France alone. Most of them were not knights. They were the ordinary population of the order, the elderly, the laborers, the estate managers, men in their 60s who had joined 30 years earlier and had never held a sword in anger. Doors were forced. Chapels were searched. Chests were counted and sealed. Livestock was inventoried. In some places, the brothers were taken while still asleep. Almost nobody resisted. There was no rising, no defense of the commanderies, no attempt to fight. Whatever the Templars were, they were not an organization prepared to make war on a Christian king in his own kingdom. By nightfall on the 13th of October, the Order of the Temple in France had effectively ceased to function as a free institution, 188 years after Hugues de Payens rode out to guard a road. We should deal at this point with Friday the 13th. You will have heard that the superstition surrounding that date originates with the Templar arrests. It is repeated everywhere, in documentaries and books and articles, and it has the pleasing quality of connecting a modern anxiety to a medieval crime. The evidence for it is essentially non-existent. There is no medieval source connecting the date to bad luck. Friday carried religious associations, being the day of the crucifixion, and 13 carried its own separate unlucky reputation in various traditions. But the combination as a specific superstition does not appear in the record until the 19th century, and it becomes widespread only in the 20th. There is an American novel from 1907 titled after the date, concerning a stock market manipulation, which did a great deal to popularize it. The Templar connection appears later still, and was massively amplified by popular fiction in the early 21st century. So the arrests did happen on Friday the 13th of October 1307. That part is entirely true. It simply does not appear to be the reason anybody is nervous about the date now. I mention this not to spoil a good story, but because it is a useful demonstration of how the Templar legend works. A real event, correctly dated, acquires a modern significance that nobody at the time attached to it, and then the modern significance is projected backwards and treated as evidence of how important the event was. You will see this happen repeatedly over the next hour. Now, the accusations. The charges laid against the order were extensive, and they were terrible. And they were also, in structure, entirely predictable to anyone familiar with how medieval heresy accusations worked. The brothers were accused of denying Christ at their reception into the order, of spitting on, or near, or at the cross, of exchanging obscene kisses during the admission ceremony, of being encouraged towards homosexual acts, of worshipping an idol, described variously and inconsistently as a head, a bearded head, a cat, or something else entirely, of failing to consecrate the host properly at Mass, of holding their chapter meetings in secret at night, of financial corruption, and of acquiring property by improper means. Look at that list carefully, and you will notice something. It is a template. Almost every element had been deployed before, against the Cathars, against various heretical movements, and against Boniface VIII himself, who had been accused by Philip's lawyers of heresy, sodomy and idolatry, only a few years earlier by the very same people now prosecuting the Templars. Nogaret had written those accusations. He now wrote these. That does not automatically make the charges false, but it does mean we are looking at a standard instrument, taken off the shelf and applied. And yet, there is a genuine puzzle here, and honest treatments of the trial do not skip past it, because a very large number of Templars confessed. Molay confessed within days. Others confessed in the weeks that followed. Confessions were obtained in France on a scale that troubled even some contemporaries, and the details in many of them are strikingly similar. We will come to why, and how, and what those confessions are worth, in a moment. But before we do, there is something important to establish about the shape of the order's own practice, because it explains why the accusations were so difficult to refute. The Templars really did hold their meetings in secret. Chapter meetings were closed. Receptions into the order took place before dawn, behind guarded doors, with a brother posted outside with a drawn sword to prevent interruption. Members were forbidden to discuss what happened at chapter with anyone outside the order. Even the full text of the rule was not made generally available. None of this was sinister. It was standard practice for religious houses, and the security precautions had obvious military logic, but it created a sealed space. And here is where the psychology becomes genuinely interesting. When people know that something happens behind a closed door, and they are told they may not know what it is, the mind does not simply record the absence and move on. It fills the space. It fills it with whatever material is available. And the material available in medieval Europe was fear. Fear of heresy, of unnatural practice, of secret contamination, of Muslim influence brought back from the East, of men who lived apart from ordinary society and did not marry and did not explain themselves. Secrecy does not conceal a vacuum. Secrecy generates content, and what it generates is almost always worse than what is actually there, because the imagination is not constrained by the requirement to be plausible or dull. Real closed-door meetings are, in the overwhelming majority of cases, staggeringly boring. Attendance is taken, accounts are read. A dispute about a hedge is discussed at unnecessary length. Nobody imagines that. The Templars had spent 2 centuries building a wall of confidentiality around procedures that were, in all probability, deeply tedious. And when the accusations came, that wall meant they had no way to say, simply, "Here is what we actually do. Look at it." They had made themselves unfalsifiable, which is a strong position, right up until the moment it becomes a fatal one. Of all the accusations, one has outlived the rest by a distance, and it is the strangest, the idol. Among the charges was the claim that the Templars venerated a head. The testimony about it is extensive, and it is also a mess, and the mess is the most revealing thing about it. Some brothers said they had seen a head. Some said it was bearded. Some said it had two faces. Some described it as gilded, or silver, or wooden, or made of a human skull. Some said it was a cat. Some said it was a beam of wood. Some said they had heard of such a thing but never seen it. Many, when pressed, described objects that sound very much like ordinary reliquaries. That last point deserves attention, because it is probably the least dramatic and most likely explanation. Medieval religious houses were full of reliquaries, and head-shaped reliquaries were entirely conventional. They were made to contain the skull, or a fragment of the skull, of a saint, and they were often silver-gilt and sometimes rather startling to look at. A silver head, kept in a locked chest, brought out on certain occasions, and treated with reverence, would have been unremarkable in any monastery in Europe. Describe the same object to an inquisitor who is asking you whether you worshipped an idol while you are frightened, and the vocabulary shifts. But the name attached to it is what carried the story forward. Baphomet. The word appears in a small number of the depositions, chiefly from the south of France, and its origin is almost certainly less exotic than its afterlife. The most widely accepted explanation among historians is that it is a corruption of Mahomet, the Old French rendering of the name of the Prophet Muhammad. The word appears in that sense in earlier Provençal poetry, entirely unconnected with the Templars, which makes the accusation, in its original context, a fairly crude one. Men who had spent 2 centuries in the East, who spoke Arabic, who negotiated treaties with Muslim rulers, who employed Muslim workers, and sometimes maintained friendly relations across the religious divide, were being accused of having gone native, of having absorbed the enemy's faith. That is not an accusation of occult devil worship. It is an accusation of cultural contamination, and it has an extremely long and unpleasant history that did not begin in 1307, and did not end there either. So where does the goat come from? Because when a modern reader hears Baphomet, what appears in the mind is a very specific image. A seated figure with the head of a goat, wings, a torch between the horns, one arm raised and one lowered, human and animal, and male and female at once. That image was drawn in 1854 and published in 1856 by a French occultist writing under the name Eliphas Lévy, whose real name was Alphonse Louis Constant. It appears in his book on the doctrine and ritual of high magic, and Levi designed it deliberately as a composite symbol, drawing on alchemical and hermetic ideas, the imagery of the tarot, and his own theories about the reconciliation of opposites. Levi was working 547 years after the arrests. His figure has nothing whatsoever to do with anything any Templar ever saw. It was an invention of 19th century French occultism, made by a man who was consciously constructing a symbolic vocabulary, and it was subsequently absorbed into every subsequent depiction of the subject, including its adoption in the 20th century by groups who wanted a deliberately provocative emblem. So the sequence runs like this. A frightened man in 1308 describes something, possibly a reliquary, using a word that probably means Muhammad. 5 centuries later, a French writer with an interest in magic borrows the word for an entirely unrelated image of his own design. And the image becomes so powerful that it travels backwards through time in the popular mind and attaches itself to men who died long before it existed. That is how legends are built, not by lying exactly, but by the accumulation of unrelated things that end up in the same drawer. Now we have to talk about the confessions, and we have to talk about torture, and I am going to do this soberly rather than luridly, because the details are not necessary, and the principle is what matters. Under French law and inquisitorial procedure of the period, confession was the highest form of proof. A case built on witnesses was good. A case built on the accused's own admission was unassailable. The entire machinery was therefore oriented towards producing confessions, and torture was a permitted instrument for producing them. There were rules, of a sort. It was supposed to be applied under specific conditions, with limits, and a confession made under torture was supposed to be freely repeated afterwards to be valid. In practice, the repetition took place with the memory of the first session entirely fresh, and the possibility of another session entirely obvious. The Templars in France were held in isolation for months and in many cases years, in conditions that were themselves punishing. They were interrogated by men who already had a list of the answers they were looking for. They were told, in some cases, that others had already confessed and that denial was pointless. They were promised reconciliation with the Church if they admitted the charges, and threatened with death as relapsed heretics if they later withdrew the admissions. The results were what such a process always produces. Of the 138 brothers examined in Paris in the initial rounds, the overwhelming majority confessed to at least some of the charges. Molay confessed. Many died in custody. Contemporary records note deaths under interrogation, and note them without much comment, which tells you something about the normality of it. Here is the crucial piece of evidence, and it is the reason most historians treat the French confessions with great skepticism. Outside France, where torture was not applied, or was applied only late and reluctantly under papal pressure, the Templars did not confess. In England, initial investigations produced almost nothing. King Edward II was initially disbelieving and slow to act. When torture was eventually introduced under pressure from the papacy, some admissions followed, but the pattern is unmistakable. In Aragon, the Templars actually shut themselves into their castles and had to be besieged, and the proceedings there produced no confessions of heresy. In Cyprus, the order was acquitted. In the German lands, in Portugal, in Italy outside certain regions, the results were similar. No torture, no confessions. The correlation is close to perfect, and it is very difficult to explain by any theory in which the confessions are describing something real. If a secret heretical practice existed throughout an international order, it did not stop at the French border. Then, in 1310, something extraordinary happened. A papal commission had been established to investigate the order as an institution, separately from the proceedings against individuals, and before it, a substantial number of Templars came forward to defend the order and retract their confessions. Hundreds of them. They organized themselves, appointed spokesmen, prepared a defense, and stated that the admissions had been extracted by torture and fear. The defense was proceeding, and it was going well. And then the Archbishop of Sens, whose jurisdiction covered Paris, and who was closely connected to the crown, convened his own provincial council and ruled that Templars who had confessed and then retracted were relapsed heretics. The penalty for relapse was death by fire. On the 12th of May 1310, 54 Templars were burned outside Paris. The defense before the papal commission collapsed immediately. Men who had been prepared to speak withdrew. The message had been delivered with complete clarity, and it required no further repetition. If you want to understand why the trial produced the outcome it did, that day in May explains a very great deal. So what did the Pope do? Clement V is not a figure who inspires much admiration, and the traditional verdict on him is that he was Philip's creature. That is too harsh, but only somewhat. He was a Gascon, elected in 1305 after a lengthy deadlock, and he never traveled to Rome. settling eventually at Avignon, and beginning the long period of papal residence in France. He was in poor health for much of his pontificate. He was surrounded by French cardinals and operating inside French territory, and he had watched what Philip's agents had done to his predecessor at Anagni. His initial reaction to the arrests was anger, and it is worth noting because it is often forgotten. Philip had arrested members of an order exempt from all authority except the papacy, without consulting the Pope, using inquisitorial procedure. It was a direct assault on papal jurisdiction. Clement suspended the inquisitors and protested, and then he negotiated and gave ground, and took control of the process in name, while allowing it to continue in substance. But in 1308, he did something that was forgotten for nearly 700 years. At the castle of Chinon, in August of that year, papal envoys examined Molay and the other senior officers of the order in private. And the record of that examination shows that, having heard their confessions and their requests for forgiveness, the papal representatives absolved them and formally readmitted them to the sacraments of the Church. That document sat in the Vatican archives, misfiled, until the Italian paleographer Barbara Fraile identified it in 2001. It was published in 2007. Its significance requires care. It does not prove the Templars innocent of everything alleged. Absolution follows repentance, and repentance implies an admission of some fault. What it does show is that the Pope's own representatives, in 1308, treated the leadership of the order as penitents, to be reconciled, rather than as heretics to be destroyed, which means the Church's private assessment and the Church's public action were not the same thing. The public action came at the Council of Vienne, which opened in the autumn of 1311. The assembled bishops proved unexpectedly reluctant. A significant majority appears to have felt that the order should be permitted to defend itself before any judgment. Philip arrived in the vicinity with an armed retinue, which was not subtle and was not intended to be. In March 1312, Clement issued the bull Vox in excelso, and the language of that document matters enormously, because it does not do what people think it does. Clement did not find the Templars guilty. He stated explicitly that the case was not proven by the evidence in a way that permitted a definitive sentence. He suppressed the order instead by administrative provision, on the grounds that its reputation had been so damaged that it could no longer usefully function. That is a remarkable admission when you read it carefully. It says, in effect, "We cannot prove this, but the scandal has made the order unusable, so it must go." A second bull, ad providam, transferred the order's property to the Knights Hospitaller. Individual Templars were dealt with according to circumstance. Many were pensioned and permitted to enter other religious houses. Some simply went home. Some had already died in prison. In most of Europe, the men themselves were not punished severely, which again sits awkwardly with the idea that anyone genuinely believed the order had been a nest of devil worshippers. But 4 men remained in prison in Paris, and their case had not been concluded. Which brings us to the last night of this story, and to the man whose name has become inseparable from it. Jacques de Molay had been Grand Master since around 1292, elected in the immediate aftermath of the fall of Acre, into a position that no longer had a war to run. He was probably in his 60s at the time of the arrests, from a minor noble family in Burgundy, a career soldier of the order who had joined as a young man and served in the East for decades. He was not, by most assessments, a subtle politician. He had opposed the merger with the Hospitallers. He had come to France to argue for a new crusade. He walked into Philip's kingdom without suspicion. He confessed, he retracted, he confessed again. Over 7 years in custody, his statements shifted repeatedly, and reading the record of them is a study in the erosion of a man. 7 years is a very long time. Consider what happens to a person in that period. He was arrested in 1307, as the head of an organization with houses in every kingdom of Christendom. By 1314, the organization had been abolished, its property given away, its members dispersed, and its name made a byword for heresy. Everything he had spent 40 years serving had been dismantled while he sat in a cell, and he had been made, by his own admissions, an instrument of that dismantling. On the 18th of March 1314, a scaffold was erected in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Molay was brought out, with Geoffroy de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy, and 2 other senior officers. The sentence was read: perpetual imprisonment, and then, according to the chroniclers, Molay spoke. He and Charnay declared that the confessions were false, that the order was innocent of the charges, that they had lied under duress, and that they would not go to their deaths with the lie standing. The reaction was immediate. The commissioners suspended proceedings to consult. Word reached the king. Philip did not wait for any ecclesiastical process. By royal order, the 2 men were condemned as relapsed heretics and taken that same evening to a small island in the Seine, near the royal gardens at the western tip of the Ile de la Cite. They were burned there as the light went. The accounts described them as calm, and as asking to be turned to face the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and dying without crying out. And contemporary observers seem to have found the manner of it disturbing, because men who had confessed to denying Christ did not usually die like that. There is a further detail that has become the most famous element of the entire story: the curse. The traditional account has Molay calling out from the flames, summoning Philip and Clement to answer for what they had done before the judgment of God within the year. Pope Clement V died on the 20th of April 1314, roughly 1 month later. King Philip IV died on the 29th of November 1314. He was 46 and died after a hunting accident or a stroke, depending on the account. Within 8 months of that evening on the island, both men were dead. Now, is the curse real? Almost certainly not in the form it is told. The earliest accounts of the execution, including one by a chronicler who may well have been present, describe the retraction and the composure, but do not contain the curse in its familiar shape. The dramatic summoning appears in later versions and grows in specificity as it travels, which is the reliable signature of legend rather than record. The deaths, however, are entirely real and correctly dated, and that is why the story is unkillable. Because here is the thing about coincidence. Human beings are extremely poor at accepting it. When 2 men die within months of an event they caused, the mind reaches for a connection, and if none is available, it will accept a story instead. Philip had spent his reign demonstrating that no institution was beyond his reach. He had humiliated a pope, expropriated communities, debased his coinage, and destroyed the most famous order in Christendom. And then he died, in the same year, at 46, and the dynasty that had ruled France for over 3 centuries failed within 14 years, as all 3 of his sons died in succession without surviving male heirs, opening the way to the succession crisis that produced the 100 Years' War. You do not need a curse to explain any of that. But you can see exactly why people wanted one. And now the mystery, which is really where most people arrive when they think about the Templars at all. Where did the treasure go? Let us start with what is actually documented, because the documented version is rarely told, and it is more interesting than the alternative. When the arrests took place, royal officials did what royal officials always do. They made lists. Inventories were taken of Templar houses across France, item by item, field by field, animal by animal. Some of those inventories survive, and what they show is a wealthy landholding organization, exactly as we would expect. Grain in barns, wine in cellars, livestock, furniture, vestments and plate in the chapels, tools, horses, debts owed to the house and debts owed by it, deeds, charters, account rolls. What they do not show is a hoard. There was no room full of gold. There were no chests of jewels. There was no accumulated treasure of the kind the legend requires. And the officials who conducted the seizure, who were highly motivated to find such a thing, and who would certainly have recorded it, did not find one. This surprises people, and it should not. Think about what the Templars actually were by 1307. Their wealth was not liquid, it was land, and land is not portable. It was buildings, and rents, and agricultural production, and mills, and the labor of tenants. Their cash flow ran through their houses continuously, and continuously ran out again, because they were an organization with enormous fixed costs, and no war to justify them. There is also a strong possibility, argued by several historians, that the order was in financial difficulty. The Eastern operations had consumed money for 2 centuries and returned nothing since 1291. Recruitment was falling, donations were declining. They were still paying for the maintenance of properties in Spain and elsewhere. The Templars may not have been sitting on a fortune at all. They may have been an asset-rich, cash-poor institution with a very expensive past. The property that existed was largely transferred, as we have seen, to the Hospitallers, not smoothly and not entirely. The French crown deducted enormous sums for the costs of custody and administration, a maneuver so transparent that it amounted to taking a substantial portion while appearing to comply. Other rulers did much the same. In England, Edward II helped himself to a good deal before the transfer went through, and various nobles simply took land and had to be pursued for years. So the honest answer to where the treasure went is that most of it was never treasure, and what there was got absorbed into the estates of other institutions and the pockets of the men in charge of the process. That is a deeply unsatisfying answer, and unsatisfying answers do not survive in the human imagination, which is where the ships come in. The legend, in its most popular form, runs like this. The Templars had advance warning of the arrests. On the night before, or in the days preceding, a fleet sailed from the Atlantic port of La Rochelle, carrying the treasury of the order, and vanished. Some versions send it to Scotland, some to Portugal. Some, in the more enthusiastic retellings, across the Atlantic entirely. Let us separate the layers. The documented layer. The Templars did possess ships. This is not in doubt. They needed maritime transport for men, horses, supplies and money, moving between Europe and the East, and later between their European provinces. They held property at La Rochelle, which was a significant Atlantic port. There is evidence of Templar vessels operating in the Mediterranean and along the Atlantic coast, but their fleet was a transport fleet, not a war fleet, and it was modest. It was nothing like a naval power. The great maritime forces of the period were Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, and the Templars chartered from them as often as they sailed their own vessels. The uncertain layer. Some testimony during the trial refers to a Templar treasurer removing valuables shortly before the arrests, and there are references to a preceptor who was said to have fled with assets. These are fragments from a compromised evidentiary process, and they are consistent with a great many explanations, including the mundane one, that someone with warning grabbed what he could. The legendary layer, the fleet of 18 ships, the disappearance from La Rochelle, the voyage to a secret destination. That specific version does not appear in medieval sources. It emerges much later, and it acquired most of its detail in the 20th century, in books written to argue a thesis rather than to examine evidence. And notice the structure of the legend, because it is beautifully designed. A fleet that vanishes cannot be disproved. There is no wreck to find, no port record to check, no destination to excavate. The claim is unfalsifiable, in exactly the same way the closed chapter meetings were, and it therefore performs the same function. It creates an empty space, and the empty space fills itself. What is genuinely documented and genuinely interesting is what happened to the Templars in the parts of Europe where nobody wanted to destroy them. Portugal is the clearest case, and it is remarkable. King Dinis of Portugal had no intention of losing the Templars. The order had been central to the Portuguese Reconquista, holding castles along a frontier the crown could not otherwise garrison, and their properties were strategically essential. So Dinis negotiated with the papacy, and in 1319, the Pope authorized the creation of a new order, the Order of Christ, which received the Templar properties in Portugal, and into which former Templars were admitted. It was, in every meaningful sense, the same organization, with a new name and a new legal foundation. And its later history is extraordinary. In the 15th century, the Order of Christ came under the governorship of Prince Henry, whom English speakers call Henry the Navigator, and the resources of the order helped fund the Portuguese voyages of exploration down the African coast, and eventually beyond. The cross of the Order of Christ was painted on the sails of Portuguese ships, so there is a real, documented, direct institutional line from the Knights Templar to the ships of the Age of Discovery. It required no secrecy, no vanished fleet, no hidden treasure. It required a king who liked his military order and a pope willing to be practical. The truth here is stranger than the legend, and it is a shame it gets told so much less often. Aragon and Castile followed broadly similar logic, folding Templar assets into existing or new Iberian orders. In Germany, many former Templars joined the Teutonic Knights. In Cyprus and elsewhere, the Hospitallers absorbed personnel as well as property. The order was abolished, the people were not. Most of them lived out their lives inside other institutions, and it is entirely likely that habits, phrases, procedures, and personal loyalties traveled with them, because that is what happens when organizations are dissolved. Which brings us to Scotland, and here we need to be careful and gentle, because a great deal of very confident material has been written on very little foundation. The Scottish claim runs roughly as follows. Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated, so papal instructions to suppress the order carried no weight in Scotland. Fleeing Templars therefore found sanctuary there, fought at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, and their traditions were preserved and eventually became Freemasonry, with Rosslyn Chapel as the physical evidence. Now the evidence. Templar proceedings did take place in Scotland, at Holyrood in 1309, and they examined a grand total of 2 brothers, both of them elderly, both of them English. The order's Scottish holdings were modest, and were transferred to the Hospitallers in the usual way. There is no contemporary source placing Templars at Bannockburn. None. The battle is well documented, and the story does not appear in any account of it until the modern period, and Rosslyn Chapel, which is genuinely one of the most beautiful and strange buildings in Britain, and which is well worth visiting if you ever have the chance, was begun in 1446 by William Sinclair. That is 134 years after the Templars were suppressed. The carvings inside it are extraordinary, and they have been read as containing Templar symbolism, Masonic symbolism, depictions of American plants carved before Columbus sailed, and encoded music. Almost all of these readings depend on the assumption that the carvings mean something specific, and almost all of them dissolve on close examination by architectural historians, who tend to identify late Gothic decorative programs of a fairly conventional kind, executed with unusual exuberance. None of which makes Rosslyn less lovely. It simply makes it a 15th century collegiate chapel rather than a Templar reliquary. So did the Templars disappear, or did they continue under other names? Both, and the distinction matters. The institution ended. The Order of the Temple, with its rule and its Grand Master and its papal privileges, ceased to exist in 1312 and has never been revived, whatever various modern organizations claim about themselves. But the people, the properties, the buildings, and to some degree the practices, were absorbed elsewhere and continued to function. That is what usually happens to institutions. They rarely vanish. They get eaten. And then there is the Grail. The connection between the Templars and the Holy Grail is one of the most persistent in popular culture, and its origins are literary rather than historical, which is an important thing to understand. Grail literature begins in the late 12th century, with Chrétien de Troyes, whose unfinished romance introduces a mysterious vessel carried in procession at a castle where a young knight fails to ask the right question. Chrétien never explains what it is. He died before finishing. That unfinished quality is precisely what made it fertile. Later writers rushed to complete the story, and each of them decided what the Grail was, and their decisions differed. Robert de Boron identified it with the cup of the Last Supper and the vessel that caught Christ's blood at the crucifixion, and this is the version most people know. And the German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach, writing his own version around 1210, made the Grail a stone rather than a cup, and placed it in a castle guarded by an order of knights he calls the Templeisen. There it is, an order of knights guarding a sacred object, in a work of fiction, written while the actual Templars were at the height of their power and reputation. Wolfram was not reporting a secret. He was doing what novelists have always done, which is borrowing the most impressive real-world institution he could think of and putting it in his story because his audience would recognize it. The Templars were the most famous armed religious order in Europe. Of course, the Guardians of the Grail resemble them, but once that association exists on the page, it never comes off again. Add the Templar headquarters on the Temple Mount, and the possibility of things buried there, and you can construct almost anything. The Ark of the Covenant, the True Cross, secret Gospels, the Treasure of Solomon, documents that would supposedly overturn Christianity itself, which is a distinctly modern flavor of the legend and reflects modern anxieties rather than medieval ones. Every one of these belongs to legend, literature, or speculation. Not one of them has a medieval documentary basis connecting it to the order. And yet the associations keep multiplying, which brings us to the largest of them, Freemasonry. Modern speculative Freemasonry emerges into clear historical view in the early 18th century, with the formation of the Grand Lodge in London in 1717, drawing on older Scottish and English lodge traditions connected with the actual craft of stonemasonry. The Templar connection appears about 20 years after that. In 1736, a Scottish Jacobite exile in Paris, named Andrew Michael Ramsay, delivered an oration to a Masonic audience, in which he traced the origins of the craft to the Crusades and to knightly orders in the Holy Land. Ramsay did not specifically say Templars, but he opened the door, and within a generation others had walked through it. By the 1750s, a German nobleman, Baron von Hund, was promoting a system of Masonic degrees called the Strict Observance, based on the claim of direct descent from the Templars via unnamed superiors whose identities he was never able to produce. The system spread widely across the continent before eventually collapsing under the weight of its own unverifiable claims. The reason this took hold is not difficult to see, and it has almost nothing to do with the Middle Ages. 18th century Freemasonry was a new organization trying to establish legitimacy in a culture that valued antiquity enormously. A society founded last Tuesday has no authority. A society descended from the Crusaders has a great deal. Constructing an ancient lineage was not an unusual thing to do at the time. It was close to standard practice. Historians of Freemasonry, including those working within the tradition, are generally clear on this. There is no documentary evidence of institutional continuity between the medieval Templars and modern Masonry. The gap is over 400 years, and it is empty. But the mythology practically assembles itself, does it not? Secret rituals, a brotherhood with degrees of initiation, symbols with hidden meanings, lost knowledge, persecution by church and state, survival in concealment. Take those elements, and it hardly matters whether the connection is real. The story is too well shaped to abandon, which is the thing about the Templars generally. They arrive in the modern imagination pre-assembled, with every component a good story needs already in place. So let us ask the question underneath all of this, which has very little to do with the 12th century and a great deal to do with us. Why are human beings so drawn to the idea of a secret order? Something in it satisfies us. Not just entertains us, satisfies us, in the way that a well-fitting explanation satisfies. And it is worth understanding why. Because the appetite is old, and it has not diminished. Part of it is straightforwardly about how the mind handles hidden information. We are pattern-finding creatures, and we are particularly alert to information that is being withheld, because for most of our species' history, information being withheld from you was a survival matter. Knowing who was talking about what, out of your hearing, mattered. The instinct that leans towards a closed door is not a flaw. It is equipment, but that equipment has a bias built into it. It assumes that concealed information is important. In reality, most concealed information is concealed for reasons of pure administrative habit and is worthless. The mind has no mechanism for weighing that possibility, so it defaults to significance. Then there is the matter of value. Something that everyone can know feels ordinary, almost by definition. The knowledge available to all cannot confer distinction on anyone. But something restricted, something available only through initiation, something you must be selected for, that carries a different weight entirely. This is not really about the content, it is about the scarcity. You can watch this operate in almost any setting. The information becomes more desirable in proportion to how difficult it is to obtain, and the difficulty of obtaining it is frequently the only thing that makes it desirable. Membership organizations have understood this for as long as there have been membership organizations. The queue outside the door is the product. Layer onto that the human need to belong, which is not a weakness but a fundamental requirement. An order offers belonging in an unusually complete form. It offers a name for what you are. It offers brothers, in the literal language of the rule. It offers a hierarchy, so that you know precisely where you stand and what advancement would look like. It offers ritual, which marks the transition between who you were and who you have become. It offers a habit, so that you can be recognized at a distance, and it offers a purpose that is larger than the length of your own life. For a younger son of minor nobility in the 12th century, with no inheritance, no prospects and no land, this was not an abstraction. It was one of the only routes available to a life with structure and meaning in it. And finally, there is what the idea of the secret order does for our understanding of power. The world is complicated, and the causes of events are usually diffuse, incremental, and boring. Prices rise because of 100 interacting factors. Wars begin through accumulated miscalculation. Institutions fail through drift. None of that is satisfying. It offers nobody to hold responsible and nothing to understand. The secret order provides an alternative shape. It says that behind the visible confusion there is a room, and in the room there are people, and the people have a plan. This is, in a strange way, a comforting proposition, even when the plan is malevolent. A world run by a hidden council is a world that makes sense. It has agency in it. It could, in principle, be opposed. The alternative, which is that nobody is entirely in charge, and events emerge from the collision of countless partial intentions, is far harder to live with. This is why the Templar legend has proved so durable, and why it is important to be careful with it. The historical order was fascinating enough without embellishment. The embellishment serves a different purpose, and it is a purpose worth recognizing in ourselves when it appears. Now let us return to the title and give it an honest answer. Were the Knights Templar more powerful than kings? No, not literally, and it is worth being precise about why. They could not make law. They could not raise armies against Christian rulers, and the rule would have forbidden it if the politics had not. They held no crown, no court, no claim to sovereignty over any European territory. Their properties existed at the sufferance of the lords who had granted them, and the kings who tolerated them. Their papal privileges depended entirely on a papacy willing to enforce them, and the moment the papacy became unwilling, the privileges evaporated in an afternoon. The evidence for their weakness is the ending itself. When a determined king moved against them, in one kingdom, on one morning, they were finished. There was no resistance, no counterstroke, no hidden reserve of power. 600 men were arrested in France, and the most famous order in Christendom simply stopped. Any organization that can be ended that easily was not more powerful than the man who ended it. And yet the answer cannot be left there, because something real is being pointed at by the question. The Templars possessed a combination of attributes that no other institution of their age had assembled in one place. International reach across every kingdom of Latin Christendom, substantial landed wealth generating reliable income, fortified property, trained military capability, financial expertise, and the trust that made it usable, religious legitimacy at the highest level, and legal privileges that placed them outside a great deal of ordinary jurisdiction. Individually, none of those is remarkable. Together, they produced something genuinely unusual, which was independence. The Templars were not more powerful than kings. They were less dependent on kings than anybody else was, and that, it turns out, is the more provocative condition of the two. Because a rival can be defeated, and a rival's power can be measured against your own, and the relationship can be understood. But an institution that simply does not need you, that operates inside your territory according to its own logic and answers to someone else, is not a rival. It is a demonstration that your authority has limits. Philip IV was engaged in the long project of proving that his authority had no limits within France. That project is the actual context for what happened in 1307. He had already proved it against the papacy. He had proved it against the Jewish communities of his kingdom and against the Lombard bankers. The Templars were, in that sense, an item on a list. The destruction of the order was not a single motive but an intersection. Financial pressure, certainly. Political consolidation, unmistakably. The genuine religious anxieties of the period, which were real and which we should not condescend to. Institutional rivalry, since the Hospitallers gained from it. Rumor, which supplied the material, and opportunity, which supplied the moment. Remove any one of those, and the outcome might have been different. Together, they were sufficient. Which leads to the thing that the Templar story is really about, underneath the castles and the trials and the treasure. Power does not always belong to the person sitting on the throne. Sometimes it belongs to whoever holds the ledger, whoever knows where the money is and how to move it, and who owes what to whom, whoever maintains the network of houses along the road, whoever keeps the records that everyone else relies upon, whoever has become so useful that removing them would be expensive. Kings wore crowns, and the crown is a magnificent piece of communication. It announces authority, and it is visible from the back of a crowd. The Templars built systems, and a system, once it is embedded, does something a crown cannot do. It continues without the attention of any particular person. It survives the death of its founders. It accumulates. It does not need to be reasserted every generation. This is why institutional power outlasts personal power so reliably, and it is a pattern you can watch repeat across every century since. The individuals who appear most powerful at any given moment are usually less durable than the structures they operate within. The structures are quieter. They do not give speeches. They are, frequently, extremely dull to look at from the outside, consisting largely of records and procedures and buildings that nobody photographs. That is not a moral, and it is certainly not advice. It is simply an observation about how power distributes itself, and the Templars are one of the clearest illustrations history has left us, precisely because their story contains both halves. They built a system that made them extraordinarily durable, and then a man with a crown removed them in a morning, and then the system he had removed turned out to be more memorable than his entire reign. Because that is the last thing, and it is the strangest. 700 years later, they are still here. They appear in novels and in films. They appear in video games, where they have been recast as the eternal antagonists of a secret war. They appear in conspiracy literature of every description. They appear on the badges of organizations that have no connection to them whatsoever. Their cross is used to sell things. Their name has been adopted by groups they would not have recognized and would probably have been appalled by. Ask most people what they know about medieval history, and you will get very little. Ask them about the Knights Templar, and something will surface. Why them? Because the story contains, in a single package, almost every element the human imagination finds irresistible. Warriors who were also monks, a holy city, a crusade, enormous wealth of uncertain origin, secret ceremonies behind guarded doors, kings and popes, a betrayal executed at dawn, torture and confession and retraction, an execution by fire, a curse that appears to have worked, a missing treasure, a fleet that sailed away and never arrived. And at the center of all of it, an unanswered question that 7 centuries of scholarship has not entirely closed. Nobody could invent that. If you submitted it as fiction, it would be rejected for excess. And yet perhaps the greatest mystery is the simplest one, and it has nothing to do with treasure at all. How did a handful of obscure knights, sleeping in borrowed rooms on the Temple Mount, with no money and no prospects and no plan beyond keeping bandits off a road, become a name that the world still repeats more than 700 years after the last of them died? Let everything slow down now. Go back to Jerusalem one final time. It is night. The city is quiet in the way that only very old cities are quiet, with the sound of it settling into the stone. The great platform lies under the stars, and the dome catches whatever light there is, and the walls that have been rebuilt and broken and rebuilt again hold the warmth of the day. The Crusades are over. They have been over for a very long time. The castles are ruins now. Chateau Pellerin on its headland, where we stood in the amber light, is a broken shell with the sea still working at the rock beneath it, exactly as it did then, exactly as it will, long after anyone reading this has gone. Safed is a scatter of stone on a hilltop. Bagras is overgrown. The commanderies in Europe have become farms, or churches, or street names, or nothing at all. In London there is a district called the Temple, full of lawyers, with a round church at the heart of it, where effigies of knights lie in the floor, and the people who hurry past it every morning mostly do not look up. Philip IV is dust. Clement V is dust. Jacques de Molay is ash on an island in the Seine, where there is now a small plaque that most tourists walk past without noticing. The treasure, whatever it truly consisted of, and it was probably barns and vineyards and account rolls rather than gold, was scattered and absorbed and spent centuries ago. The order is gone, completely, permanently gone, in a way that very few things in history are, and yet the name remains, the Knights Templar. There is an irony in that, which is worth resting on, as the night settles. Philip IV destroyed the order utterly. He achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. There is no order of the temple. His victory was total, but by destroying it so dramatically, in the dark, with sealed orders and simultaneous arrests, and accusations of unspeakable secret rites, and an old man burning on an island in the river, he did something he could not possibly have intended. He gave them a story, an order that had simply faded away after 1291, merged into the Hospitallers, wound down its estates and vanished into the paperwork of the 14th century, would be a subject for specialists. Nobody would make films about it. Nobody would carve its cross into anything. Philip made them a mystery, and mysteries do not die. Perhaps that is the strangest kind of power of all. Not the power to command armies, not the power to lend money to kings, not the power to hold a fortress against a siege, or to build a network across a continent, or even the power to survive, but the power to remain inside the human imagination, long after every stone has fallen, every account has been settled, every enemy has died, and every question has been asked for the last time. Let all of it fade now. Let the walls of medieval Jerusalem soften and go. Let the pilgrim road empty. Let the horses in the courtyard grow quiet, and the lamps in the long dormitory be put out one by one. Let the ships on the dark Atlantic sail on out of sight without needing to arrive anywhere. Let the candle-lit rooms of the commanderies, with their chests and their ledgers and their careful, tedious, extraordinary records, close their doors for the night. There is nothing left to follow, nothing to remember, no question that needs answering before morning. Thank you for spending this night exploring another strange chapter of human history with me. It is a privilege to be here while you fall asleep. If you enjoyed this journey, you are very welcome to subscribe to Sleep into Power. You can find the show on Spotify, explore the Sleep into Power book on Amazon, visit the companion channel Meditate into Power for guided meditations and something stiller, and support the channel through Buy Me a Coffee if you ever feel moved to. But not now. All of that can wait until you are awake. For now, let your breathing slow. Let the weight of your body settle into wherever you are lying. Let the last images go, one by one, until there is only the dark and the quiet and the warmth. Sleep into power, guys. Good night.